Hi, I'm Stewart. I'm a retired Air Force regular captain, former judge advocate, and a trained law of armed conflict advisor. I'm here today to talk to some patriots in a town that I'm not from, and the goal is to convey to those who may be members of militia units what their responsibilities, obligations, and some of their rights under the Geneva Conventions. There are those who believe that militia units aren't entitled to protection under the Geneva Conventions, and they are entitled to those protections, and being entitled to protections entails a responsibility to abide by the conventions, and that has some very serious considerations with respect to our efforts and what we're trying to do as a group, and could affect our ability to succeed. So with that as a basis, I've prepared some handouts that I will be leaving with folks and that will be available for circulation so that any Patriot group in the area will be able to obtain a copy of each of the documents and circulate them amongst the members, or have the people who need to read each document read the document. The first document that I've brought some copies of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. This is basically what we mean when we talk about your rights as a prisoner of war, the rights of medical personnel. It deals with naval personnel, but since we're not going to be conducting operations at sea in any sense, I'm not going to address the naval aspects of it. And it also talks about the general rights and protections that have to be afforded to civilians. I'm going to bring that up because that's one of the most important things that militia don't realize, and quite frankly, some of the comments that I hear are rather scary in that regard, because folks talk about what they're going to do to this group or what they're going to do to that group. And as soon as something like that happens, you're going to have representatives of 175 armies around the world sending troops to the United States to quell you. On the other hand, abide by the Geneva Conventions, and international law requires those countries to stay out of the way, stay out of the United States. So we don't want to do anything that triggers them coming in. That's why an understanding of the Geneva Conventions is so important to militia units. That's why I said that if you violate the Geneva Conventions, it can cost us the war. Because I know we've got 80 million guns. Now in the whole world, they've got too many for us to think about 80 million as stopping them. Okay? We don't want to go there, folks. I've been in combat. I've been in combat more than I like to remember. None of us want to be there, trust me. The first time you see a friend get hit and you go over and you pick him up and his head falls one way and you're holding his body, you don't want to be there ever. And that's what happens in war. So we want to be prepared for it. We want to have the strength to force people to respect the law. If people respect the law, we don't have to fight. Because all we want is the Constitution. If we have that, then everything else we want follows. No, we won't get our way in everything. But the Constitution doesn't require that, and peace doesn't require that. It simply requires that we have the fair share of what's guaranteed to us by the Constitution. If we have the Constitution in place and effective, we have the rights guaranteed to our children and grandchildren that we are preparing to fight to defend. And notice I say preparing, because if you're prepared and the other side knows you're prepared, and if you're strong enough that they think that it'll be bloody, hopefully they will exercise the same common sense that we're willing to exercise. And then we'll start doing things right, and we'll get things back on track. Not a great hope, but it's there, and that's what we're really preparing to try to do. And I know that 99% of you agree with me on that. Okay, having said that, that addresses the book that's in the Geneva Conventions of 1949. It's got red on the front and back covers. It's got a Red Cross, and it's published, in fact, by the International Red Cross, which is the agency that has the primary responsibility for supervising, if you will, the implementation of the conventions. The second book that I've brought along is a book called the Law of Armed Conflict Desk Book. This one's published by the Army Judge Advocate General of the Judge Advocate General of the United States Army. It's more intended for the legal advisors to the units. You may not have attorneys, but if you don't, you need to have somebody in your organization who studies this book, who studies the Geneva Convention materials, and who learns what they need to know in order to understand what limits there are before you commit war crimes. And that's what this book is aimed at. It's to tell you how you apply the various provisions. And trust me, when you get out in combat, very often you do have to make a decision. Can I do this or can I do that? And if it's a really close call as to whether it's a war crime, you don't want to go across that bridge. Because if you go across that bridge, suddenly the United States, or the United Nations, by the Geneva Convention, has a role in enforcing the law of armed conflict. They have a role in quelling any hostile force that transgresses that law. It's not a perfect law, but you have to know what it is. And finally, and this is one for every member of every militia unit, it's a summary of the provisions of the Geneva Conventions. What's important about this pamphlet is you don't have to be a lawyer to understand it. But in the military, we give these provisions to every private, every airman, every seaman, and every Marine. And we do that because they need to know what they're required to do when they're out there on the field. You don't need to know anything about this for training. But if the shit hits the fan, you need to know the answers to this. It's not that long, 7 pages. Each page is 5 inches by, or rather 8 inches by 5 inches. Not that big, kind of fine print. I apologize for that, but it's the size that it is. Again, that pamphlet is published by the International Committee of the Red Cross, but it's important for every member of your organization to have one copy of it. If you don't get enough copies for your organization, find a copy from somebody and duplicate it. It's not copyrighted. It's free access. Just make as many copies as you need and pass them out. But make sure everybody understands what's in there. Because if they go out and they violate the Geneva Conventions and then a regular military force comes through, they don't have to respect your brothers and sisters in combat. Meaning that they can do things that would be illegal. And they can get away with it because it's called the law of retribution. That's authorized by the Geneva Conventions. A word on the law of retribution. If enemy forces are violating the Geneva Convention, clearly and grossly violating the Geneva Convention, then for your political entity, whoever has the ultimate political authority in your entity has the authority to authorize retribution for that violation. It's not something that the soldier in the field makes a decision. It's not even something the commander in the field makes the decision. It has to be what we call a civil authority. Now, I will grant you that the head of a militia can be designated as the civil authority. We're Americans. We don't have dictators. If the head of our militia is our civil authority, that's a dictator. You might as well go join the tyrants. So what I'm telling you is, if you want to run your militia the way Americans set up militias, you get a civilian authority. You elect a group, and they run your operations. They set your policies, and the head of that group decides whether or not to invoke the doctrine of retribution. The head of that group also becomes liable for the forces being trained to do things properly, so whoever gets that responsibility is accepting a big responsibility. But that's the way Americans do business, folks.